you know him. Maybe you are him. The man who seems to have everything figured out on the surface but can never fully commit to anything real. Not to a relationship that demands vulnerability. Not to a career that requires sacrifice. Not to a life that asks him to finally grow up. He floats through existence collecting experiences like trophies but never planting roots anywhere. He charms everyone he meets but disappears the moment things get serious. He talks about his dreams constantly, but never takes the concrete steps to build them. And if you look closely into his eyes, you'll see something haunting there. A boy trapped inside a man's body, desperately afraid of the one thing he needs most, to finally become an adult. Carl Jung called this the Puer Aeternus, the eternal boy. And it's not just a personality quirk or a lifestyle choice. It's a psychological prison that millions of men are trapped in right now, and most of them don't even know it. They think they're free because they avoid commitment. They think they're living authentically because they refuse to settle. But the truth Jung discovered is far more disturbing. These men aren't free at all. They're running from the most essential task of human existence, the terrifying journey from boyhood into authentic manhood. And the longer they run, the emptier they become. This isn't about age. You can be 50 years old and still be a pure. You can have a job, a house, even a family, and still be psychologically stuck in adolescence, because the Puer Aeternus isn't defined by external circumstances. It's defined by an internal refusal, a deep, unconscious resistance to the weight of adult responsibility, to the limitations of real commitment, to the death of infinite possibility that comes when you finally choose one path and let the others go. The Puer lives in potential. He's always about to become something great, always on the verge of his breakthrough, always one decision away from his real life beginning. But that decision never comes, because making it would mean killing the fantasy, and the fantasy is all he has. Jung saw this pattern everywhere in his practice. Men who seemed intelligent, talented, even charismatic, but who couldn't sustain anything real. They would start relationships with intense passion, and then slowly withdraw as things got deeper. They would begin ambitious projects with tremendous energy, and then abandon them when the tedious work of completion set in. They had 1,000 reasons why they couldn't commit. The timing wasn't right, the opportunity wasn't perfect. They needed to keep their options open. They were protecting their freedom. But underneath all those justifications, Jung found the same core wound. A terror of the concrete. A fear of being trapped in the ordinary. A narcissistic fantasy that they were destined for something special. Something that didn't require the messy, unglamorous work of building a real life. And here's what makes this so insidious. The Puer Aeternus convinces himself that his refusal to commit is a form of spiritual seeking. He tells himself he's staying open to possibility. He's not settling for mediocrity like everyone else. He's protecting his authentic self from the soul-crushing conformity of conventional life. He reads books about enlightenment and talks about consciousness and surrounds himself with the language of growth. But Jung saw through this immediately. This isn't spiritual seeking, it's spiritual bypassing. It's using the language of transcendence to avoid the fundamental human task of incarnation, of actually becoming someone specific, of accepting your limitations, of building something real in the messy, imperfect world of concrete choices and irreversible commitments. The Puer lives in his head, in fantasies of who he could be, relationships he might have, lives he could live if only the conditions were right. He's addicted to potential because potential never disappoints you. Potential never reveals your limitations. Potential never demands that you sacrifice your narcissistic fantasy of unlimited specialness. But here's what Jung understood that most people miss. This refusal to commit isn't freedom. It's the deepest form of bondage. Because you can't actually live in potential. You can only live in reality. And reality demands that you make choices. Real choices that eliminate other options. Commitments that limit your freedom. Decisions that reveal who you actually are, not who you fantasize about being. Think about the man who can't commit to a relationship. He'll tell you he's protecting himself from settling. He's waiting for the right person, the perfect connection, the relationship that won't require him to compromise. But watch what happens when he meets someone who could actually be that person. Watch how he finds flaws, how he notices all the ways she's not quite right, how he starts to feel trapped by her expectations, how he pulls away the moment she needs him to show up consistently. Because the problem was never finding the right person. The problem is that any real relationship will eventually demand that he stop being the eternal boy and become a man. It will demand emotional maturity, consistent presence, the ability to prioritize someone else's needs alongside his own. And that terrifies him, because deep down, he doesn't believe he's capable of it. Deep down, he's still a boy playing at being a man, terrified that if he tries to be one for real, everyone will see through the act. Jung traced this back to what he called the mother complex, and this is where it gets really uncomfortable for a lot of men. The Puer Aeternus is psychologically still attached to the mother archetype, not necessarily to his actual mother, though that's often part of it, but to the fantasy of unconditional love, unlimited support, a world that revolves around his needs without demanding anything difficult in return. The mother, in Jungian psychology, represents the original state of union, the safety of the womb, the time before separation, before individuation, before you had to become someone distinct and limited and mortal. And the Puer is trying to get back to that state. He's looking for relationships that recreate that unconditional acceptance, jobs that feel effortless, a life that doesn't require him to struggle or sacrifice or prove himself through sustained effort. But here's the truth Jung discovered. You can't go back. The journey of psychological development only moves in one direction. You have to separate from the mother. You have to individuate. You have to become your own person, which means accepting that you're limited, flawed, mortal, and capable of failing. The Puer refuses this journey. He stays psychologically merged with the mother complex, which means he never develops the capacity for real intimacy. Because intimacy requires two separate individuals. Not a boy looking for a mother substitute. Not a man who needs his partner to make him feel special and supported without demanding that he show up as an adult. And this is why the Puer often appears so charming at first. He has a kind of boyish enthusiasm that's very appealing. He's playful, spontaneous, full of ideas and dreams. He makes you feel like life is an adventure. But give it time. Watch what happens when real demands appear. When someone needs him to be consistent. When a project requires him to push through the boring, difficult middle phase. When a relationship asks him to be vulnerable about his fears instead of just his fantasies. He disappears. Not always physically. Sometimes he just becomes emotionally unavailable, distant, suddenly critical of the very things he was excited about weeks ago, because the reality is setting in. And reality means limitation. And limitation means death to the fantasy. And the fantasy is the only thing protecting him from the terror of being ordinary. Jung believed this was one of the central neuroses of modern life, especially for men, because somewhere along the way, we've created a culture that celebrates the Puer. We worship potential. We idealize the entrepreneur who's always starting new ventures, but never building sustainable businesses. The artist who talks about his vision but never finishes the work. The man who's had 20 relationships but never learned how to love someone through the unglamorous years of real partnership. We call this freedom. We call this authentic living. But Jung would call it arrested development, a refusal to grow up disguised as a refusal to sell out. And here's what's so painful about this pattern. The Puer isn't happy. He might seem free and spontaneous and full of life, but underneath there's a deep emptiness, a sense that nothing really matters, a feeling that he's always on the outside of real life, watching other people build things while he stays perpetually on the verge of beginning. Jung called this the secret melancholy of the Puer, the depression that comes from never fully investing in anything, because you can't feel truly alive without commitment. You can't experience depth without staying long enough to get past the surface. You can't know who you really are until you've been tested by the sustained demands of a real life. The opposite of the Puer Aeternus in Jung's framework is the Senex, the old man, the archetype of structure, discipline, commitment, limitation. And most people think this is what the Puer is running from. The boring, rigid, soul-crushing conformity of conventional adulthood. But that's not what Jung meant by the Senex. The healthy Senex isn't about conformity. It's about maturity. It's the capacity to make commitments and honor them even when you don't feel like it. To build something slowly over time. To accept your limitations and work within them instead of constantly fantasizing about transcending them. To show up consistently for the people who depend on you. To do the unglamorous work that real achievement requires. And here's the paradox Jung discovered. The Puer thinks he's preserving his freedom by avoiding commitment, but actually he's trapped in a loop. He's constantly starting over, constantly running from the consequences of his choices, constantly avoiding the very experiences that would allow him to mature. Real freedom comes from the other side of commitment, from knowing who you are because you've tested yourself in the real world, from having depth in your relationships because you stayed through the difficult parts, from having genuine skill because you dedicated yourself to mastering something instead of sampling everything. The Puer's freedom is the freedom of a ghost. He can pass through walls, but he can't touch anything. He can't build anything. He can't leave a mark on the world because he's never here long enough to matter. So what does it look like when a man finally breaks free from the Puer complex? It's not a comfortable process. Jung was clear about this. It requires what he called the death of the divine child. The ego death of your narcissistic fantasy that you're special, unlimited, destined for greatness without effort. It requires grieving the lives you didn't live, the possibilities you didn't pursue, the perfect version of yourself that will never exist. It requires accepting that you're going to disappoint people, that you're going to fail sometimes. That commitment means limitation. That building a real life means saying no to 1,000 other lives you could have lived. But on the other side of that death is something the Puer never experiences. Actual substance. Real presence. The capacity to be there for people in a way that matters. The satisfaction of building something that lasts. The depth that comes from staying with something or someone long enough to get past the infatuation phase and into the real work of creation. Jung called this individuation. Becoming who you actually are instead of who you fantasize about being. And it only happens through commitment, through choice, through accepting limitation and working within it, instead of constantly trying to transcend it. This doesn't mean settling for a life you hate. It doesn't mean giving up on your dreams or conforming to expectations that don't fit you. But it does mean growing up. It means developing the capacity to stay with difficulty, to work through conflict instead of running from it, to build something slowly instead of constantly chasing the high of new beginnings, to accept that real love, real work, real life is often unglamorous and demanding, and requires you to show up even when you don't feel inspired, especially when you don't feel inspired. And here's what Jung saw in the men who managed to break free from the Puer complex. They didn't lose their vitality. They didn't become rigid or boring or soul dead. Actually, they became more alive, more real. More capable of genuine joy because they were finally experiencing real life instead of fantasizing about it. They had actual relationships that challenged and changed them. Actual work that revealed their real capacities, not just their imagined ones. Actual presence in the world. They stopped being boys trapped in men's bodies and became men. Not perfect men, not unlimited men, but real men who could handle the weight of adult responsibility without collapsing under it or running from it. So if you recognize yourself in this, if you see the pattern of the eternal boy playing out in your life, what do you do? Jung would say the first step is simply seeing it, not judging it, not hating yourself for it, but recognizing the pattern, noticing how you pull away when things get real, how you sabotage commitments, how you keep one foot out the door in relationships, how you're always planning your next move instead of being present in your current one, how you use the language of authenticity and freedom to avoid the terrifying task of actually becoming someone. The second step is understanding where it comes from. What are you really running from? Usually it's not commitment itself. It's what commitment represents. The end of infinite possibility, the acceptance of limitation, the terror of being ordinary, the fear that if you fully invest in something and it doesn't work out, you'll have to face the truth about yourself, that you're not special, that you're capable of failure, that you're mortal and limited and there's no magical escape from the human condition. These are the truths the pure is running from, and you have to face them. You have to grieve the fantasy. You have to accept that you're not going to become the unlimited, perfect version of yourself you've been imagining. You're going to become this specific, limited, imperfect person, and that's not a tragedy. That's the beginning of real life. The third step is practice. You build the capacity for commitment by committing. Start small if you need to. Finish something you started. Stay in a difficult conversation instead of withdrawing. Show up for someone even when you don't feel like it. Do the boring, repetitive work that skill development requires. And notice what happens in your body when you want to run. Notice the panic, the claustrophobia, the voice that tells you you're betraying yourself by staying. That voice is the Puer, and you don't have to obey it. You can feel the discomfort and stay anyway. And slowly, over time, you'll develop the muscle of adult presence, the capacity to be here fully, in your actual life, instead of always dreaming about the life you could be living somewhere else. This is the work Jung dedicated his entire career to understanding. The journey from unconsciousness to consciousness, from potential to actuality, from the fantasy of unlimited possibility to the reality of chosen limitation. And he was clear that most people never make this journey. Most people stay trapped in various forms of psychological adolescence their entire lives, not because they're weak or lazy, but because the journey is genuinely terrifying. It requires dying to who you thought you were. It requires accepting truths about yourself and reality that your ego has been defending against your whole life. But if you don't make this journey, you never really live. You exist in a kind of liminal space, neither fully in the world nor fully out of it, always preparing for your real life to begin but never beginning it, always on the verge of commitment but never committing, always promising depth but never delivering it. And the years pass, and you look back and realize you've been running in place, that all your movement was just an elaborate avoidance of the one thing that would have actually changed you, the decision to stop running, to plant yourself somewhere, to commit to someone or something deeply enough that it transforms you, to finally grow up. So here's the question Jung would ask you. What are you really running from? Not the surface reasons, not the stories you tell yourself about timing or readiness or keeping your options open, but the deep truth underneath. What commitment represents to you, what limitation means, what you're terrified will be revealed about you if you finally stop moving and let yourself be seen. Because until you face that terror, you'll keep running. And the longer you run, the harder it becomes to stop. Because the gap grows between the fantasy of who you could be and the reality of who you are. And at some point, that gap becomes unbearable. And you're trapped. Too afraid to commit because it will reveal your ordinariness, but too empty to keep running because the fantasy has stopped working. The way out is through. Always through. You have to face what you're running from. You have to grieve the unlimited boy and become the limited man. You have to accept that this is your one life and it's happening right now. And every day you spend fantasizing about the life you could be living is a day you're not living the life you have. This is the essential truth. The needed truth. And once you see it, really see it, you can't unsee it. You can keep running if you want, but you'll know what you're doing. You'll know you're choosing the fantasy over reality, choosing the eternal boy over the actual man you could become. And at some point, that awareness will become unbearable, and you'll finally be ready to stop running. That's when real life begins. Not when everything is perfect, not when you've figured it all out, not when you've become the unlimited version of yourself you've been imagining, but when you finally accept your limitation and work within it, when you commit to something real and let it change you, when you stop protecting your potential and start building something actual. That's when you step out of the pure prison and into authentic manhood. Not perfect manhood, real manhood, the kind that can handle weight, the kind that shows up, the kind that stays. And if you're ready to make that journey, the path is clear. Stop running. Face what you're afraid of. Grieve the fantasy. Choose something real. And stay with it long enough to let it transform you. That's the work. That's the only work that matters. Everything else is just another form of running. If this hit you somewhere deep, if you recognize yourself in this pattern and you're ready to stop running, make a choice right now. Hit that subscribe button. Not because I need it, but because it's practice. It's a small commitment, a declaration that you're done floating and ready to plant roots somewhere, even if it's just in a YouTube channel about psychology. Leave a comment about where you see the pure pattern in your life. Say it out loud. Make it real. And if you know someone who's trapped in this cycle, share this with them. Not as an attack, but as an invitation. Because the first step out of the pure prison is seeing that you're in it. And sometimes we need someone else to hold up the mirror. Next time, we're going deeper into the shadow work that makes this transformation possible. The parts of yourself you've been running from. The darkness you have to integrate before you can step into authentic manhood. The truths about yourself that the eternal boy is terrified to face. Because growing up isn't just about commitment. It's about wholeness. And wholeness requires meeting everything you've been avoiding. Everything you've been too afraid to see. Stay needed.